Hello, welcome to the world of stories. Here, each video is a journey full of emotion, mystery, and unforgettable adventures. Thank you for clicking to watch and embarking with us on another captivating narrative. If you like stories that hold your attention and touch the heart, don't forget to like.
The morning air was crisp as Seraphina Calloway stepped off the old rusting bus that had carried her to Rosewood Ranch. The sprawling countryside stretched before her, bathed in the golden hues of dawn. The fields seemed to roll on endlessly, bordered by dense clusters of trees that stood as silent sentinels. In the distance, the Montgomery estate rose like a beacon of grandeur, a sprawling white mansion with a wraparound porch, pristine despite the years, crowned by towering chimneys that exhaled faint wisps of smoke. Seraphina adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag, the only possession she had carried with her since leaving her hometown. At 24, her life had been a series of struggles and restarts, but she hoped that this new opportunity would bring stability. Working as a housekeeper on one of the wealthiest estates in Texas might not have been her dream, but it was steady work, something she desperately needed. Her boots crunched against the gravel path as she walked toward the mansion, her heart hammering in her chest. The closer she got, the more imposing the estate became. Rosewood Ranch wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of power and wealth. But Seraphina wasn't here to marvel at the Montgomery's fortune. She was here to work, to build a life she could be proud of. A middle-aged woman with a sharp face and a no-nonsense demeanor greeted her at the front steps. She introduced herself as Mrs. Culpepper, the head housekeeper. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her piercing gaze seemed to assess Seraphina's worth in an instant. "You're late," Mrs. Culpepper said, her tone clipped. "The bus was delayed," Seraphina replied, her voice steady despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. Mrs. Culpepper harumphed, not entirely satisfied with the excuse but willing to let it slide. "Follow me. I'll show you to your quarters." Seraphina followed the woman through the grand front doors, her eyes widening as she took in the opulence of the mansion's interior. Polished wood floors gleamed under ornate chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with oil paintings of Montgomery ancestors, their stern faces seeming to judge her as she passed. The air smelled faintly of lavender polish, and every corner of the space spoke of meticulous care. Rule number 1, Mrs. Culpepper began as they ascended a staircase. "You don't speak to Mr. Montgomery unless spoken to first." Rule number 2, the family's affairs are none of your business. "Keep your head down, do your job, and we won't have any problems." "Yes, ma'am," Seraphina replied, her voice quiet but firm. Mrs. Culpepper glanced over her shoulder, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't seem like the type who would cause trouble, but I've been wrong before. Just remember your place, Miss Calloway." Seraphina nodded, holding back a retort. She was here to work, not to argue. Her quarters were small but clean, a modest room tucked away in the servants' wing of the mansion. A single bed with crisp white linens stood against one wall, a small desk and chair against another. A narrow window offered a view of the stables in the distance, and Seraphina found herself momentarily mesmerized by the sight of horses grazing in the morning light. After unpacking her few belongings, she reported to the kitchen, where Mrs. Culpepper wasted no time putting her to work. By noon, Seraphina had scrubbed floors, polished silver, and dusted furniture that seemed as old as the mansion itself. Despite the physical labor, she found herself grateful for the distraction. The rhythm of the work helped keep her mind from wandering too far into the past, a place she didn't want to revisit. By mid-afternoon, Seraphina had a moment to catch her breath. She stepped outside into the back garden, the sun warming her face as she closed her eyes for a brief reprieve. The hum of bees and the chirping of birds filled the air, and for the first time that day, she felt a flicker of peace. "Not what you expected, huh?" The voice startled her, and she turned to see a man leaning casually against a nearby oak tree. He was tall, his lean frame clad in faded jeans and a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His dark brown hair was slightly tousled, as though he'd just stepped off a horse, and his piercing green eyes held a spark of mischief. "I'm sorry?" Seraphina stammered, unsure of what to make of him. "The work," he said, a crooked smile playing on his lips. "It's harder than it looks, isn't it?" Seraphina straightened her posture, not wanting to appear flustered. "It's nothing I can't handle." "Good to know," he replied, pushing off the tree and walking toward her. "I'm Elias, by the way. Elias Montgomery." Her breath caught. This was the infamous heir to the Montgomery fortune, the man who had a reputation for shirking his responsibilities and stirring up trouble. Seraphina had heard whispers among the staff earlier that day, stories of his reckless behavior and strained relationship with his father. "Seraphina Calloway," she said, extending her hand. Elias took it, his grip firm but not overwhelming. "Nice to meet you, Miss Calloway. Don't let Mrs. Culpepper scare you off. She barks a lot, but her bite's not so bad." Seraphina smiled faintly, unsure of how to respond. There was a charm to Elias that she hadn't anticipated, but she reminded herself that men like him were trouble, especially for someone like her. "I should get back to work," she said, stepping away. "Of course," Elias said, his tone light. "But if you ever need a break from all the rules around here, come find me. I'm pretty good at breaking them." Seraphina shook her head, half amused, half wary. She didn't intend to find him for anything, but something about his easygoing nature lingered in her thoughts as she returned to her duties. That evening, as Seraphina lay in bed, her body aching from the day's labor, she replayed the events of the day in her mind. Elias Montgomery was nothing like she had imagined. He was confident but not arrogant, approachable yet enigmatic. But she also knew the dangers of getting too close to someone like him. Her position at Rosewood Ranch was tenuous at best, and any hint of impropriety could cost her everything. As she drifted off to sleep, Seraphina resolved to keep her head down and her heart guarded. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that her encounter with Elias was only the beginning of something she couldn't control. The sun was barely up when Seraphina began her second day at Rosewood Ranch. The morning air carried the faint scent of dew and hay, and the stillness of the early hour offered a brief moment of calm. She tied her apron tightly around her waist, bracing herself for another day under Mrs. Culpepper's relentless gaze. Her first task was to polish the grand staircase, a centerpiece of the mansion with its intricate mahogany railings and steps so glossy they reflected light like a mirror. As she worked, she couldn't help but feel the weight of the portraits staring down at her. The Montgomerys of generations past, frozen in oil and canvas, seemed to disapprove of her presence. But Seraphina ignored their judgmental gazes. She focused on the rhythm of her movements, the sound of the cloth against wood soothing her nerves. "Good morning, Miss Calloway." The voice startled her, and she turned to see Elias Montgomery standing at the base of the staircase, leaning casually against the banister. His presence was as commanding as it was effortless. He was dressed in worn jeans and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, exposing strong forearms. A smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth as he watched her. "Good morning, Mr. Montgomery," she replied, straightening her posture. "Elias," he corrected, stepping closer. "We don't stand on formalities here." Seraphina hesitated. "I think Mrs. Culpepper would disagree." Elias chuckled, the sound low and warm. "Mrs. Culpepper disagrees with most things. Don't let her scare you off." "I'm not easily scared," Seraphina said, her voice steadier than she felt. Elias tilted his head, his green eyes studying her. "I can see that." For a moment, silence hung between them, charged with an energy Seraphina couldn't quite define. She turned back to her task, hoping he would take the hint and leave, but instead he leaned against the banister, watching her work. "You've been here what a day?" he asked. "Yes," Seraphina replied, keeping her focus on the railing. "And what do you think of Rosewood Ranch so far?" "It's impressive," she admitted. "Bigger than anything I've ever seen." "It's a lot to take in," Elias said. "But you'll get used to it. Just watch out for my father." The mention of Luther Montgomery sent a chill down her spine. She had yet to meet the man, but the stories she had heard from the other staff painted a picture of someone cold, exacting, and utterly unyielding. "I'll keep that in mind," she said carefully. Elias smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "He can be difficult. Just stay on his good side, and you'll be fine." Seraphina paused, glancing at him. "And what about you? Should I stay on your good side too?" Elias's smirk deepened, and for a moment, he looked genuinely amused. I don't know. Should you? Before she could respond, the sound of Mrs. Culpepper's voice echoed through the hallway. Miss Calloway, the dining room needs attention. Seraphina felt her stomach drop. She turned to Elias, but he simply winked. Good luck, he said, stepping aside as she hurried past him. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of tasks. Seraphina scrubbed, dusted, and polished until her arms ached. But no matter how busy she kept herself, she couldn't shake the memory of her conversation with Elias. There was something about him that unsettled her, a mixture of charm and danger that felt impossible to ignore. By early afternoon, she was sent to the stables to deliver clean linens for the groomsmen's quarters. The stables were a sprawling structure, lined with rows of stalls that housed some of the finest horses in the state. The air was rich with the scent of hay and leather, and the sound of hooves against straw echoed softly. As she entered, she spotted Elias again. He was in one of the stalls, brushing down a sleek black mare with a coat that shimmered like onyx. His movements were steady and practiced, a sharp contrast to the carefree demeanor he had shown earlier. You're following me, Miss Calloway, he said without looking up. Seraphina frowned. I'm delivering linens. It's hardly stalking. Elias chuckled, setting the brush aside. He stepped out of the stall, wiping his hands on a cloth. I'm just teasing. What do you think of her? He gestured toward the horse. She's beautiful, Seraphina said, genuinely admiring the animal. This is Midnight, Elias said, running a hand along the mare's neck. She's got a bit of a temper, but she's loyal once she trusts you. Sounds like someone else I've met, Seraphina said before she could stop herself. Elias raised an eyebrow, his expression a mix of surprise and amusement. Touché. Seraphina felt a blush rise to her cheeks and quickly turned her attention back to the linens. I should get back to work. Seraphina. The way he said her name stopped her in her tracks. She looked back at him, and for a moment, the playful smirk was gone, replaced by something softer. Don't let this place change you, he said quietly. People like my father. They'll try to make you feel small. Don't let them. His words struck a chord deep within her, but before she could respond, a voice called from outside the stables. Elias. It was Luther Montgomery. Elias's expression hardened instantly, and he turned toward the sound of his father's voice. I'll see you around, Miss Calloway, he said, his tone lighter but distant. Seraphina watched as he strode out of the stables, his posture tense, his shoulders squared. She didn't know what kind of man Luther Montgomery was, but it was clear his presence cast a long shadow over his son. That night, as Seraphina lay in bed, she replayed the day's events in her mind. There was something about Elias Montgomery that made her both curious and cautious. He was unlike anyone she had ever met, charming yet guarded, confident yet burdened. But she also knew that whatever connection they might share, it was a dangerous one. Her position at Rosewood Ranch was fragile, and getting involved with the boss's son was a risk she couldn't afford to take. As she closed her eyes, she told herself to keep her distance, to stay focused on her work. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The days at Rosewood Ranch settled into a rhythm, but for Seraphina, nothing felt routine. The mornings were spent scrubbing, dusting, and polishing, the afternoons delivering supplies to various parts of the estate, and the evenings attempting to quiet her thoughts as she lay in her small room. But no matter how hard she worked to keep her head down, one presence seemed to linger on the edge of her thoughts: Elias Montgomery. It wasn't just the stolen glances or the brief conversations that haunted her. It was the way he made her feel seen, as if she weren't just another servant in a sprawling estate ruled by a man with an iron fist. Elias had a way of cutting through the rigid formality of the Montgomery world, his warmth and humor a stark contrast to the cold efficiency of his father. But Seraphina knew better than to indulge these thoughts. She had seen what happened to people who forgot their place, and Luther Montgomery didn't strike her as a man who forgave easily. Late one afternoon, Seraphina was sent to the garden to collect fresh herbs for the evening's dinner. The sprawling grounds were a testament to the Montgomerys' wealth, filled with manicured hedges, vibrant flower beds, and fountains that sparkled in the sunlight. The herb garden was tucked away near the greenhouse, a quiet corner of the estate where the hum of bees and the rustle of leaves provided a rare moment of tranquility. As she knelt to gather sprigs of rosemary, she heard footsteps approaching. Her heart sank. She wasn't supposed to be distracted from her work, and the staff had been clear about avoiding unnecessary delays. Taking a break? The familiar voice sent a shiver down her spine. She looked up to see Elias leaning against the edge of the greenhouse, his shirt sleeves rolled up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I'm working," Seraphina replied, her tone guarded as she returned to her task. "So serious," he teased, stepping closer. "You always this focused?" "When I need to be," she said, refusing to look at him. "Relax, Miss Calloway," he said softly. "I'm not here to scold you." She sighed, finally glancing up at him. "What are you doing out here, Mr. Montgomery?" "Elias," he corrected, crouching down beside her. "And maybe I just wanted to talk to someone who doesn't measure every word they say to me." Seraphina hesitated, her hands stilling over the herbs. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "Why not?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. "Because people are watching," she said, lowering her voice. "And your father." "Let me worry about my father," Elias interrupted, his expression darkening. "That's easy for you to say," Seraphina shot back, surprising even herself with the sharpness of her tone. "You're his son. You have a safety net. I don't." Elias blinked, taken aback, but then he nodded slowly. "Fair point." The silence between them stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Elias spoke again, his voice quieter. "Do you ever feel trapped?" The question caught Seraphina off guard. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time saw the cracks in his polished facade. His green eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, held a hint of sadness, and the set of his jaw betrayed tension she hadn't noticed before. "Every day," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Then I guess we have something in common." Seraphina felt her resolve waver. There was a vulnerability in Elias that made her want to lower her guard, to let him in despite every warning flashing in her mind. But before she could say anything, the sound of a throat clearing made her freeze. "Miss Calloway." Seraphina turned to see Mrs. Culpepper standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable but her posture rigid. "Your assistance is required in the kitchen," Mrs. Culpepper said, her tone cool but clipped. Seraphina quickly stood, clutching the herbs she had gathered. "Yes, ma'am." She started toward the house, her heart pounding in her chest, but she could feel Mrs. Culpepper's gaze shifting to Elias. "Mr. Montgomery," Mrs. Culpepper said, her voice polite but firm. "Perhaps you'd prefer to assist your father with the horses." Elias gave a faint smirk, unbothered by her thinly veiled reprimand. "Perhaps I would." Seraphina didn't dare look back as she walked away, but she could feel the tension behind her like a weight pressing against her back. That evening, Seraphina worked in silence, her mind racing. Mrs. Culpepper hadn't said anything more about the encounter in the garden, but Seraphina could sense disapproval radiating from the older woman. The other staff members also seemed to watch her more closely, their whispers following her like a shadow. She knew she had to be more careful. Elias might be charming, but his attention was dangerous. The Montgomery's world was not a place for someone like her to take risks. But her resolve was tested when she found herself alone in the hallway near the servants' quarters late that night. She was heading to her room when she heard a soft knock on the back door. She opened it cautiously and found Elias standing there, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, "for putting you in a difficult position today." Seraphina stared at him, unsure of what to say. "I mean it," he continued. "The last thing I want is to make your life harder. But I can't seem to stay away." Her breath caught, and for a moment, all the warnings and fears in her mind were drowned out by the sincerity in his voice. "Elias," she began, her tone wavering. "This can't happen. Your father." "I don't care about my father," Elias interrupted, stepping closer. "I care about you." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Seraphina shook her head, her voice trembling. "You don't even know me." "Then let me," he said simply. She wanted to protest, to tell him to leave, but the intensity in his gaze left her speechless. "Good night, Seraphina," he said finally, stepping back. "I'll see you tomorrow." And with that he was gone, leaving her standing in the doorway, her heart racing and her thoughts in turmoil. As she closed the door and leaned against it, Seraphina knew she was on dangerous ground. Whatever connection she felt with Elias Montgomery, it could cost her everything. But a small, treacherous part of her whispered that maybe, just maybe, it was worth the risk. The days following her late-night encounter with Elias were a blur for Seraphina. She threw herself into her work, determined to avoid him at all costs. But Rosewood Ranch was a world of its own, and crossing paths with Elias seemed inevitable. He didn't make it easy to keep her distance. Whether it was a fleeting smile across the garden or a casual remark in the hallway, Elias was always there, a constant reminder of the thin line she was walking. Seraphina told herself it was for the best to ignore him, to keep her focus on her duties. But her resolve faltered every time he looked at her, like she was more than just another servant in the Montgomery household. One crisp morning, Seraphina was assigned to clean the library, a grand room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and illuminated by a massive crystal chandelier. The air smelled of old paper and wood polish, a comforting combination that made the space feel oddly intimate despite its grandeur. She worked quietly, dusting each shelf methodically, when she heard the door creak open behind her. "Miss Calloway," came a voice that made her heart sink. She turned to find Luther Montgomery standing in the doorway. The patriarch of the family was as intimidating as the rumor suggested, tall, broad-shouldered, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see through her. "Yes, sir," Seraphina said, keeping her tone as neutral as possible. Luther stepped inside, his presence commanding the room. "How are you finding your duties here at Rosewood?" "They're fine, sir. Thank you for asking," she replied, her hands clutching the dust cloth tightly. "Good," Luther said, his tone sharp. "Because we expect a certain standard here. I trust you understand the importance of discretion in a household like ours." "Of course, sir," Seraphina said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. Luther's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before he gave a curt nod. "Carry on." As he turned to leave, Seraphina let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But her relief was short-lived. That evening, the Montgomerys hosted a small gathering of business associates and family friends in the grand dining room. Seraphina and the other staff worked tirelessly to ensure every detail was perfect, from the polished silverware to the carefully arranged floral centerpieces. Seraphina stayed in the background, blending into the scenery as much as possible. But her heart sank when she saw Elias enter the room, his presence impossible to ignore. He wore a tailored black suit, his dark hair neatly combed, and his green eyes scanning the room with an ease that betrayed his discomfort at the event. Their eyes met briefly, and Seraphina quickly looked away, focusing on refilling glasses and avoiding any interaction. But as the evening wore on, her luck ran out. Near the end of the night, Seraphina was tasked with bringing a tray of desserts into the dining room. As she stepped inside, balancing the tray carefully, she caught sight of Elias standing near the fireplace, speaking with a group of men. His gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, she thought he might say something. But before he could, one of the other staff members, a man named Tom, who had worked at Rosewood for years, stepped into her path. "Careful there, Miss Calloway," Tom said, his voice low but laced with something that set her on edge. "Excuse me," she said, trying to move past him. Tom smirked. "You think nobody's noticed? The way he looks at you." Seraphina froze, her pulse quickening. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you don't," Tom said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Just be careful. Mr. Montgomery doesn't take kindly to servants who overstep." Seraphina pushed past him, her hands trembling as she set the tray on the table. She could feel Tom's gaze on her back, and the weight of his words lingered long after she left the room. The next day, Seraphina's worst fear became a reality. It was early afternoon when Mrs. Culpepper summoned her to the parlor. Seraphina's stomach churned as she walked into the room, where Luther Montgomery sat in a leather armchair, his expression cold and unyielding. Mrs. Culpepper stood beside him, her face tight with disapproval. "Miss Calloway," Luther said, his voice calm but cutting. "It has come to my attention that you and my son have been fraternizing." Seraphina's heart dropped. "Sir, Spare me your excuses," Luther interrupted, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. "Do you think I'm blind to what's been happening under my roof?" "Nothing inappropriate has happened," Seraphina said quickly, her voice trembling. Luther's eyes narrowed. "That may be true for now, but the perception is all that matters. You have already crossed a line by allowing yourself to be seen with him. Mr. Montgomery, I promise. You will leave this estate by nightfall," Luther said, his voice final. "You're no longer welcome at Rosewood Ranch." Seraphina's knees threatened to give out beneath her. "Please, sir. I need this job. I have nowhere else to go." "That's no longer my concern," Luther said, standing and straightening his jacket. "Your actions have consequences, Miss Calloway. Perhaps this will serve as a lesson." Tears stung her eyes as she left the room, her chest tight with panic. Word of her dismissal spread quickly among the staff, and by sunset, Seraphina was packing her belongings in her small room. Elias appeared in the doorway, his expression dark with anger. "What's going on?" "I have to leave," Seraphina said, her voice breaking. "Your father found out about us, about everything." "This isn't right," Elias said, his fists clenching. "He can't do this." "He can," Seraphina said, wiping her eyes. "And he has." Elias stepped closer, his voice softening. "I'll fix this, Seraphina. I won't let him do this to you." She shook her head, her heart breaking. "You can't fight him, Elias. He's too powerful." "I don't care," Elias said fiercely. "I won't let him win." Seraphina looked at him, torn between hope and despair. "I need to go," she said quietly, stepping past him. Elias didn't stop her, but the pain in his eyes was etched deeply. As Seraphina climbed into the cab waiting outside the estate, she looked back at Rosewood Ranch one last time. The sprawling mansion that had once felt like an opportunity now loomed like a fortress, its gates closing behind her with finality. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do next. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same. The bus rattled along the narrow country road, the faded scenery outside blurring as Seraphina rested her head against the cool window. She clutched her worn leather bag tightly, her only anchor in a world that suddenly felt unmoored. Her departure from Rosewood Ranch still stung like an open wound, but she had no choice but to move forward. She had found temporary refuge in the small town of Maplewood, about an hour from the ranch. The town was modest but welcoming, its streets lined with family-run shops and a handful of diners. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and newcomers were both a curiosity and a cause for speculation. Seraphina had managed to secure a room in a boarding house owned by an older woman named Mrs. Hartwell. The room was simple but clean, with lace curtains on the windows and a quilted blanket on the bed. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Her first days in Maplewood were consumed with finding work. The town wasn't brimming with opportunities, but Seraphina eventually landed a position at a small convenience store. The pay was minimal, but it was enough to keep her afloat. The store was owned by a kind man named Henry Wilder, who took a chance on her despite her lack of experience in retail. "You've got a good head on your shoulders," Henry had said as he handed her an apron. "And around here, that's worth more than anything." Seraphina threw herself into the job, grateful for the distraction. Stocking shelves and ringing up customers kept her mind busy, but the ache in her chest never fully subsided. Elias's face haunted her thoughts. She replayed their last conversation over and over, the anguish in his voice when he promised to fight for her. She wanted to believe him, but she knew the weight of his father's influence. Luther Montgomery was not a man to be defied. One evening, after closing up the store, Seraphina decided to explore the town. The streets were quiet, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows on the cobblestones. She wandered aimlessly until she found herself in a small park on the edge of town. The park was nearly deserted, save for a man sitting on a bench under a large oak tree. He was dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans, his work boots scuffed with dirt. He looked up as she approached, his kind face breaking into a warm smile. "Evenin'," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Good evening," Seraphina replied, hesitating for a moment before sitting on a nearby bench. "I don't think I've seen you around before," he said, his tone friendly. "Name's Noah Hargrove. I run the veterinary clinic here in town." "Seraphina Calloway," she said, managing a small smile. "Seraphina," Noah repeated, as if testing the sound of it. "Pretty name. What brings you to Maplewood?" She hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "Just looking for a fresh start," she said finally. Noah nodded, his expression understanding. "We all need that sometimes." The two fell into an easy conversation, talking about the town and its quirks. Noah was charming in a quiet, unassuming way, his laughter warm and genuine. For the first time in weeks, Seraphina felt a sliver of normalcy. As the days turned into weeks, Seraphina found herself settling into life in Maplewood. Her job at the store kept her busy, and she began to form tentative friendships with the locals. Noah became a frequent visitor to the convenience store, always finding a reason to chat with her. But no matter how much she tried to move on, her thoughts always drifted back to Rosewood Ranch, and to Elias. Elias, meanwhile, was waging a silent war with his father. Since Seraphina's departure, the tension between him and Luther had reached a boiling point. Elias refused to fall back into his old patterns of complacency, challenging his father at every turn. He had started taking an active role in the ranch's operations, a move that both surprised and infuriated Luther. One afternoon, as the two stood in the stables overseeing the horses, Luther finally confronted him. "You've been distracted," Luther said, his tone sharp. "I'm managing just fine," Elias replied, his voice cold. "Don't play games with me, Elias," Luther snapped. "Your focus needs to be here, not on some foolish infatuation." Elias clenched his fists, his anger simmering just below the surface. "What you did to Seraphina was cruel. She didn't deserve that. And you think bringing her back will fix anything?" Luther countered, his eyes narrowing. "She doesn't belong in this world, Elias. Neither of you would survive it." Elias stared at his father, his chest tight with frustration. "Maybe I don't want this world anymore." Luther's expression hardened. "Then you're more foolish than I thought." Without another word, Elias turned and walked away, the weight of his father's words pressing down on him. Back in Maplewood, Seraphina's life took an unexpected turn. One evening, as she was closing the store, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. She turned to see a sleek black sedan parked at the curb, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The door opened, and Elias stepped out. Seraphina's breath caught as he walked toward her, his expression a mix of determination and relief. "Elias," she whispered, her heart racing. "I had to find you," he said, his voice raw. "I couldn't let things end like that." She stared at him, torn between joy and fear. "How did you?" "I asked around," he interrupted, stepping closer. "I know I shouldn't be here, but I couldn't stay away." "Elias, your father." "Forget my father," he said fiercely. "I don't care what he thinks. I care about you." Tears welled in Seraphina's eyes as she looked at him. "You don't understand what you're risking." "I do," Elias said, his voice steady. "And you're worth it." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Seraphina wanted to believe him, to let herself hope. But she knew the Montgomery's power, and the cost of defying them. "Elias," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if this can work." "It can," he said firmly. "If we fight for it." As his words sank in, Seraphina realized she was standing at a crossroads. She could push him away, protect herself from the storm she knew was coming. Or she could take a chance, risk everything for the man who had risked everything for her. She didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time in weeks, she felt the faintest glimmer of hope. The evening air in Maplewood was thick with tension as Seraphina stood outside the convenience store, staring at Elias. The flickering neon sign above them cast faint shadows across his face, but nothing could dull the intensity in his green eyes. "You're serious," Seraphina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been more serious," Elias replied, his voice steady and resolute. "I'm not here to make promises I can't keep. But I'm here because I know what I want. I want you, Seraphina." Her heart twisted at his words, torn between longing and fear. "Elias, if we do this, if we try your father." "Let me worry about my father," he interrupted, his tone firmer now. "I've spent my whole life letting him dictate what I can and can't have. This time, he doesn't get to decide." Seraphina looked away, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to believe him, but her scars from Rosewood Ranch still felt fresh. "Do you even know what you're asking for?" she said, her voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. Your father controls everything. He's not going to let this happen." Elias stepped closer, his voice softening. "I don't care about his control. What he has doesn't matter to me, not if it means losing you." For a moment, Seraphina allowed herself to meet his gaze. There was something raw and unguarded in his expression, a vulnerability she had never seen before. She wanted to say yes, to let herself fall completely. But before she could answer, a voice interrupted them. "Am I interrupting something?" Seraphina turned sharply to see Noah Hargrove standing a few feet away, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. His easy smile faltered as he took in the tension between her and Elias. "Noah," Seraphina said, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I was just walking by and saw you," Noah said, his gaze flickering to Elias. "Didn't realize you had company." Elias straightened, his posture tightening. "And you are?" "Noah Hargrove," he said, extending a hand. "Friend of Seraphina's." Elias hesitated for a moment before shaking Noah's hand, his grip firm. Elias Montgomery. Recognition flashed across Noah's face, followed by a shadow of unease. Montgomery, huh? That's a name people around here don't forget easily. Small town, Elias said, his tone neutral. Noah's eyes narrowed slightly, but he kept his voice calm. Seraphina, you okay? I'm fine, she said quickly, sensing the growing tension between the two men. Noah hesitated before nodding. If you need anything, you know where to find me. He gave Elias a pointed look before turning and walking away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. When they were alone again, Elias let out a slow breath. Friend of yours? Yes, Seraphina said, feeling the need to defend Noah. He's been kind to me since I got here. Elias frowned but didn't press the issue. I should go, he said, his voice quieter now. But think about what I said. Please. Seraphina nodded, her emotions a storm inside her. Good night, Elias. Good night, Seraphina, he said, lingering for a moment before walking back to his car. She watched him drive away, her heart heavy with uncertainty. The next morning, Seraphina found herself restless as she worked her shift at the store. Noah stopped by, his demeanor friendlier than the night before but still tinged with concern. Busy night? He asked casually as he placed a coffee on the counter. Something like that, Seraphina replied, avoiding his gaze. Noah leaned against the counter, studying her. Look, I don't want to stick my nose where it doesn't belong, but Montgomerys have a reputation. You know that, right? I know, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Noah raised his hands in mock surrender. I'm just saying, be careful. That kind of world. It can chew you up and spit you out. Seraphina sighed, guilt and frustration twisting inside her. Thanks for the concern, Noah. Really. But I can handle myself. He nodded, though his expression remained troubled. Meanwhile, back at Rosewood Ranch, Elias was preparing for the fight of his life. He sat in the boardroom of the main estate, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. Luther Montgomery was seated at the head of the table, his icy blue eyes fixed on his son. What is this about, Elias? Luther asked, his tone clipped. I'm here to tell you that I'm leaving, Elias said, his voice steady. Luther arched an eyebrow. Leaving? And where exactly do you think you'll go? Anywhere but here, Elias replied. I've had enough of your control, your rules. I'm done living under your thumb. Luther leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And what brought on this sudden rebellion? Let me guess, it's that girl. Elias didn't flinch. Her name is Seraphina. And yes, she's part of the reason. But this is about more than her. This is about me taking control of my life. Luther laughed coldly. You think you can walk away from this? From the Montgomery legacy? You have no idea what you're throwing away. I know exactly what I'm walking away from, Elias said, his voice rising. A life built on your greed and manipulation. I don't want it. The room fell silent, the tension between father and son crackling like a live wire. You'll regret this, Luther said finally, his tone low and dangerous. No, Elias said, standing. The only thing I'd regret is staying. That night, Elias drove back to Maplewood. The weight of his confrontation with his father lingered, but for the first time in years, he felt free. He arrived at Seraphina's boarding house just as the sun was setting, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. She was sitting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold her emotions in. When she saw him, her eyes widened. Elias, what are you doing here? I told you, he said, stepping closer. I'm not letting him control me anymore. I'm here for you, Seraphina. If you'll have me. Tears welled in her eyes as she stood, her heart racing. Elias, you gave up everything. I didn't give up anything that mattered, he said, taking her hands in his. You matter. We matter. That's all I need. For a moment, she hesitated, the weight of their journey pressing down on her. But then she saw the sincerity in his eyes, the unwavering determination that had brought him back to her. And she realized she couldn't let fear hold her back any longer. I'll have you, she whispered, her voice breaking. But only if you're sure. I've never been more sure, Elias said, pulling her into his arms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they stood together, ready to face whatever came next. The morning air was fresh with the scent of spring blossoms as Seraphina stood in the middle of the small ranch she and Elias now called home. The sun cast a golden glow over the rolling hills, bathing the modest farmhouse and weathered barn in warm light. It wasn't Rosewood Ranch, it was smaller, quieter, and far less extravagant, but it was theirs. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his hair still damp from the morning shower, a mug of coffee in one hand and a smile on his face. He looked at Seraphina with the kind of warmth that melted away all the doubts she had carried for so long. "Thinking about something?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Just everything," she replied, her voice soft. "How far we've come." Elias walked over, slipping an arm around her waist. "We built this together," he said, his tone full of pride. "And it's only the beginning." Months had passed since Elias had walked away from his father's shadow, choosing a life with Seraphina over the Montgomery legacy. The decision hadn't come without consequences. Luther Montgomery had severed ties with his son, cutting him off from the family fortune. But Elias didn't care. With what little savings he had, Elias purchased the small ranch on the outskirts of Maplewood, determined to create something meaningful with Seraphina. Together, they worked tirelessly to renovate the property, transforming it into a sanctuary that felt like home. The people of Maplewood had embraced them as one of their own. Henry from the convenience store often stopped by with supplies, and Mrs. Hartwell never failed to bring fresh baked goods. Even Noah, who had been wary of Elias at first, had come around, offering advice on caring for their small herd of cattle. Seraphina and Elias had created a community, one built on love, trust, and the kind of hard work that brought real satisfaction. One warm evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias and Seraphina sat on the porch, watching the sky transform into a canvas of pinks and purples. Ethan, the young boy from next door, was running around the yard, chasing fireflies with a jar in hand. "Think we'll ever see your father again?" Seraphina asked quietly, breaking the peaceful silence. Elias hesitated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Maybe. Maybe not." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But it doesn't matter. I found what I need right here." Seraphina reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of you, Elias. For everything you've done, for us. And I'm proud of you," he said, leaning in to kiss her forehead. "You gave me a reason to fight. To build a life worth living." As they sat together, watching the stars begin to appear, Seraphina felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. For the first time in her life, she felt truly at home. Years later, Seraphina and Elias's ranch had become a thriving part of the Maplewood community. They had expanded the property, raising horses and cattle while opening their doors to anyone who needed a fresh start, much like Seraphina had once needed. Their love had weathered storms, grown deeper with time, and inspired those around them. They had proven that true happiness wasn't found in wealth or power, but in the simple, profound act of choosing each other every day. As they stood hand in hand, watching a new generation of ranchers learn the ropes on their land, Seraphina smiled. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about building something beautiful out of broken pieces, and finding love in the unlikeliest of places. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey through Seraphina and Elias's story. From the sprawling halls of Rosewood Ranch to the humble beauty of their new home, we hope you felt every moment of love, heartbreak, and triumph. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue creating content that inspires, captivates, and brings unforgettable stories to life. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. We have so many more amazing tales to share with you. Thank you for being part of our community. Together, we can keep telling stories that remind us all of the power of love, resilience, and hope. See you in the next video.